The morning Hester Reed was loaded into a wagon like a piece of furniture headed for auction. She told herself she would not cry, and she held to that promise with every rattling mile that carried her away from the only home she had ever known. It was the spring of 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was still a place where a woman's future could be decided by a handful of letters exchanged between men who had never once asked her opinion. Hester was 22 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed in the way of a woman who had spent too many years reading by insufficient lamplight and listening at doors she was not supposed to know were open. Her father, Clarence Reed, had died the previous November owing debts that his daughter had not known existed until the creditors appeared on the doorstep of their modest ranch outside of Santa Fe, with papers that made it entirely plain the land was no longer hers to stand on. There was a man named Gerald Whitmore in the town of Redemption, 2 days' ride northeast through Broken Country and Red Rock Canyon. Gerald Whitmore was 43 years old, twice widowed, and prosperous enough that he could afford to take on the debts of a dead man in exchange for that dead man's daughter. He had written a letter to the lawyer handling Clarence Reed's estate, and the lawyer had presented the arrangement to Hester the way a doctor might present an amputation, with the tone of a man who is sorry but not particularly troubled about what comes next. There had been no proposal. There had been no courtship. There was only the letter, the debt, and the date on which Hester was expected to arrive. The lawyer had arranged an escort. One man, a rider for hire who did jobs that did not require any particular virtue beyond the ability to stay in the saddle and deliver what he was paid to deliver. His name, the lawyer had told her with the briefest possible interest, was James Dalton. Hester had not slept the night before her departure. She had sat in the empty room that had once been her father's study, surrounded by furniture that was now someone else's furniture, and she had read every book she could still reach from the shelves that had not yet been cleared. She read the way a drowning person swims, not because she expected to reach any shore, but because stopping meant sinking. James Dalton arrived at the edge of the property at first light, riding a bay horse that moved with the quiet authority of an animal that had covered a great deal of difficult ground in its years. He was 28, lean in the way that men who live outdoors become lean, with dust already on his coat, and a jaw that looked as though it had been set in deliberate opposition to the habit of smiling. He was not unfriendly exactly, but he carried the particular economy of a man who had learned that words cost something, and preferred not to spend them unless the purchase was worth making. He tipped his hat when he saw her standing beside the wagon with her trunk already loaded, and her hands folded in front of her like a woman preparing for a church service she had not chosen to attend. "Miss Reed," he said. "Mr. Dalton," she said. That was the whole of their introduction. The lawyer's clerk drove the wagon. James rode alongside. The road out of Santa Fe was good for the first several miles, wide enough and well-traveled enough that the wagon moved without complaint, and Hester sat in the back of it with her spine very straight and her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though she could find something worth looking at if she just committed to looking hard enough. She had promised herself she would not cry. She had not promised herself she would not think, and so she thought with great thoroughness about everything that was being taken from her. The ranch, the smell of her father's tobacco, which still clung to certain corners of certain rooms. The library, such as it was, with its cracked spines and margin notes in her father's handwriting. The way the light came through the kitchen window in the afternoons and turned the dust motes into something almost like gold. She thought about Gerald Whitmore, whom she had never met, whose letter she had read 3 times and found increasingly less tolerable with each reading. He had written about the arrangement with the satisfaction of a man completing a transaction, which was precisely what it was. He had not written about her. He had written about the resolution of her father's debts. He had written about the house in Redemption and the size of his cattle operation and the expectation that she would find everything quite comfortable. He had not written one word about what she might find comfortable, but he had used the word comfortable 4 times, as though repetition would transform a cage into a parlor. James Dalton had been riding for perhaps 40 minutes when the road curved around a low rise and began to descend toward a dry creek bed that would need to be crossed before the terrain opened up again. He had ridden this way before, not recently, but recently enough to remember that the crossing was passable in dry season. It was dry season. He did not anticipate trouble. The trouble came anyway. The left wheel of the wagon found a crack in the hardpan at the bottom of the creek bed that the driver had not seen, and the crack was deep enough and wide enough that the wheel dropped into it with a sound like a shot, and then stopped moving entirely. The axle made a noise that told James everything he needed to know before he even climbed down from his horse. He walked around to look at it. The axle had not snapped, but it had twisted in a way that made it clear the wagon was not going anywhere under its own power in the immediate future. The clerk climbed down and looked at the wheel. He was a young man who worked indoors and whose experience with wagon repairs was limited to having once watched someone else perform one. He looked at James with the expression of a man expecting to be told what to do. James knelt down and looked at the wheel more carefully. He pressed his hand to the axle and felt the bend in it. He stood up and pulled his hat off and put it back on again, which was the closest thing he had to an outward expression of frustration. "Can it be fixed?" Hester asked from the back of the wagon. "Not out here," he said. "Not today." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then what do we do?" James looked at the road behind them, then at the road ahead. They were less than 2 miles from where they had started. He could see the faint smudge of Santa Fe still visible against the pale morning sky. He looked at the terrain to the east, which was where they were headed, and thought about what lay between them and the next settlement large enough to have a smith capable of repairing an axle or providing a replacement wagon. "There's a way station about 4 miles east," he said, "operated by a man named Cornelius Hatch. He keeps horses. Might have a wagon or a cart, might be able to send back for repair." The clerk cleared his throat. "I have to get back to Santa Fe," he said. "I have documents that need to be filed by the afternoon." James looked at him with the flat patience of a man who finds himself unsurprised by other people's priorities. "Then go," James said. The clerk looked at Hester. Hester looked at James. James was already unhitching one of the wagon horses. "She can ride," James said. "The way station isn't far." Hester had been riding since she was old enough to be put on a horse, which in her case had been very young, because her father believed that the best way to prepare a child for the territory was to get them comfortable on horseback before they were old enough to think too hard about falling. She did not say any of this to James. She simply climbed down from the wagon, accepted the reins of the unhitched horse, and pulled herself up with the ease of someone who has done the same thing several hundred times. James watched this. He had half expected argument, or at least some expression of difficulty. He got neither. He got a woman settling herself into a saddle with the calm competence of someone who did not particularly need to be helped, and then looking at him with an expression that said, clearly, that she was ready whenever he was. He gathered his own reins and started east along the road without further ceremony. She came alongside him, and they rode like that, close enough to speak but far enough that the fact of their proximity was not awkward, and the morning light spread out across the red and yellow desert floor in front of them with the particular beauty of a place that does not care whether anyone finds it beautiful. They did not speak for the first mile. It was Hester who broke the silence, not because she was the kind of woman who filled silence out of discomfort, but because she was the kind of woman who said things when she had decided that saying them served a purpose. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Doing what?" "Riding Escort. Delivering people." He glanced at her sideways. 6 years, he said. "You were 22 when you started." "You can count," he said. She did not smile, but something around her mouth suggested she thought about it. "I can," she said. "What did you do before?" He was quiet for a moment. Worked cattle, he said. Before that, other things. Other things, she repeated in the tone of a woman cataloging an insufficient answer. Followed the work, he said. Like most men out here. She nodded and looked ahead. The desert was full of sound, even in its apparent stillness. The clatter of rock doves somewhere behind them, the low sigh of wind moving through scrub brush. The methodical percussion of 4 hooves on hard ground, then 4 more. "Mr. Dalton," she said, after another pause. "Miss Reed, are you aware of the circumstances of this particular escort?" He had been told, briefly, by the lawyer. He had been told there was a woman who needed to reach redemption and a man there who was expecting her, and that the matter was a straightforward matter of transport. He had been told this with the deliberate vagueness of a man who understood that the full details of the arrangement were not things that made a job easier to accept. "Some of them," he said. "And does it bother you?" she asked. "Delivering a person the way you might deliver a parcel?" The question was not sharp. It was honest, and he recognized the difference. He took his time with the answer. "I don't think of it that way," he said finally. "How do you think of it?" "I think of it as getting someone safely from one place to another," he said. "What happens when they get there is their own business." She looked at him steadily for a moment. He was watching the road ahead, which gave her the opportunity to look at his profile. The set of his jaw, the careful way his eyes moved across the terrain in the habit of a man who has learned that the desert announces its dangers quietly, and only to those paying attention. "That is a very tidy way of not thinking about something," she said. He said nothing to that. She had not intended it as an accusation, and he received it as something closer to the truth than he was entirely comfortable with, which he did not feel it was necessary to confirm aloud. The way station appeared after another 20 minutes of riding, a low arrangement of adobe and weathered timber set against a formation of sandstone that caught the morning light and turned the color of a coal just starting to glow. There was a corral with several horses in it, and a water trough, and a linta that served as a makeshift smithy, and smoke coming from the chimney of the main building in a lazy column that suggested someone was already at work on the stove inside. Cornelius Hatch came out of the building at the sound of horses, because he was the kind of man who always came out at the sound of horses, having spent enough years in the territory to know that the sound of horses arriving unannounced was information that needed to be assessed in person. He was a large man, somewhere past 50, with hands that looked as though they had been shaped by a different and more demanding process than the hands of ordinary people. He had a beard the color of iron filings and eyes that took in the situation with the efficient intelligence of someone who had seen a great many situations. "Dalton," he said. "Wheel trouble?" "Axle," James said. Hatch nodded. "How far back?" "About 2 miles, creek bed." "I'll send Miguel." He looked at Hester with the polite non-intrusiveness of a man who had learned that it was not his place to ask questions about the people who came through his way station, but offered them the same hospitality regardless. "Ma'am." "You're welcome inside. Coffee's on." Hester dismounted and thanked him. James tied both horses at the rail and followed her inside. The interior of the way station was dark and close and smelled of coffee and wood smoke and horse leather, and something that was probably salt pork. There was a long table made from boards that had once been something else, and 2 benches, and a stove at the far end that was ancient and massive and very much operational. A woman Hester had not seen from outside appeared from behind a curtain that divided the room, carrying a tin pot in each hand with the confident ease of a woman who had been managing difficult spaces for a long time. Her name was Esperanza, and she was Cornelius Hatch's wife, and she had the kind of warmth that does not announce itself but makes itself immediately evident in the way a room feels different when the person carrying it enters. She set coffee in front of James without being asked and looked at Hester with a frank and friendly appraisal. "Eat something," she said. "You look like you haven't." "I haven't," Hester admitted. Esperanza disappeared behind the curtain again, and returned with a plate of beans and corn bread, and a piece of salt pork, and set it in front of Hester without fanfare. Then she sat down at the other end of the table with her own coffee, and regarded them both with the comfortable ease of a woman who has seen enough travelers pass through to understand, without being told, that the two people sitting at her table were in some kind of complicated circumstance. James wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and watched the steam rise from it. Hester ate because she was genuinely hungry and because Esperanza's lack of ceremony made it easy to do so without feeling like an imposition. "How long until the repair?" Hester asked. "Depends on the axle," James said. "Could be a few hours, could be tomorrow." She set her fork down and looked at the table for a moment. Tomorrow. She was supposed to arrive in Redemption tomorrow. Gerald Whitmore was expecting her. The thought of Gerald Whitmore expecting her produced a sensation in her chest that she identified with some precision as something between dread and anger. She was not afraid of him, exactly. She did not know enough about him to be afraid of him specifically. She was afraid of the abstract fact of him, the fact that he was waiting for her, that she was being delivered to him, that this delivery was what her life had been reduced to since her father's death. She picked her fork back up and ate the rest of the beans, because dread and anger were not reasons to waste food. James watched her from across the table, not in the obvious way of a man watching a woman, but in the peripheral and habitual way of a man who monitors the people around him as a matter of survival instinct. He noted the steadiness of her hands. He noted the set of her shoulders, which did not drop even when she thought no one was looking. He noted the fact that she had asked practical questions, how long for the repair, not what would happen to her, and that she had answered Esperanza's invitation to eat without any of the practiced hesitance that women sometimes performed when they did not want to appear too hungry or too needy. He did not think about any of this in an organized way. He simply registered it, the way he registered the condition of a horse or the feel of the weather changing, as information about the landscape around him. Cornelius Hatch's man Miguel returned toward midday with the broken wagon in tow behind a pair of draft horses. He and Hatch examined the axle together and conferred in the practical shorthand of two people who had worked side by side long enough to think in the same direction, and their conclusion was that the repair was possible but would take until the following morning. Hester took this news standing in the doorway of the way station, her hand on the doorframe and her eyes on the middle distance. "There's a room," Esperanza said, from somewhere behind her. "Nothing much, but it's clean and the bed is real." "Thank you," Hester said. That evening, James sat outside on a bench near the corral and watched the last of the light leave the western sky in stages, orange to pink to a deep bruised purple that faded into the particular darkness of the territory on a clear night, absolute and full of stars in a way that always surprised people who had not experienced it before. He had his hat in his hands and was turning it in slow circles, which was something he did when he was thinking without quite deciding to think. He heard footsteps in the dirt and looked over to find Hester Reed coming to sit on the fence rail near the corral, not next to him, but close enough that they were in the same part of the evening together. She had her arms crossed over her chest and was looking at the same sky he was looking at. "You can see everything from here," she said quietly. "That's the territory," he said. "My father used to say that the sky in New Mexico was bigger than anywhere else in the world," she said. "I used to think he was being provincial. Now I think he was just right." James looked up at the sky again. It was, in fact, very large. "What was he like?" he asked. The question surprised her. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that shifted slightly, some small relaxation of the careful control she had been maintaining all day. "He was kind," she said, "and not very practical. He read everything he could get his hands on and believed most of it. He thought things would work out, which was a fine way to live until they didn't." She paused. "He loved this land. He just wasn't very good at the business of holding on to it." "I'm sorry," James said. She looked at him steadily. "You mean that?" she said. "I do." She was quiet for a moment. The horses in the corral moved and settled with the restless patience of horses at night. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Dalton?" "James," he said without quite deciding to say it. Then, because it was said, "It's a long ride and we're not in anyone's office." Something in her expression softened. "James," she said, and his name in her voice was a different thing than it was anywhere else. "Did you read the details of the arrangement about where I'm going?" "I was told the essentials." "Gerald Whitmore has twice buried a wife," she said. "I don't know what that means about him." "Maybe it means nothing. Men bury wives in this territory, it's not always their fault. But I don't know him at all. I have never met him. I have read one letter from him, and it was the letter of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants in the way that business dealings get resolved." She paused. "I am 22 years old. I read 3 languages and I have an opinion about almost everything, and no one has asked for even one of my opinions in the entirety of this process." James said nothing. He was not sure there was anything to say that would not be either insufficient or inadvisable. He was aware, very keenly, that he was a man paid to bring her to someone she did not want to go to, and that awareness sat in him, the way a stone sits in a boot, not debilitating, but impossible to ignore. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it," she said, as if she had heard the shape of his silence correctly. "I'm just telling you, because I think you are a person who actually listens when someone speaks, and I have not had many opportunities lately to speak to someone like that." He looked at her then directly, and she looked back at him without turning away, and the night was very large and very full of stars, and the space between them on that fence rail was not very wide. "I'm listening," he said. She talked, not as a woman performing grief or resentment for an audience, but as a woman who had been holding a great weight alone for a long time and had been offered, temporarily, someone to help hold it. She talked about her father and about the ranch, and about the years she had spent keeping the books for the property because no one else was going to, and about the morning the creditors had come, and the way the lawyer had presented the arrangement as though he were doing her a favor. She talked about the books she had read and the things she had wanted to do with her life that had been gradually narrowed down until the only open door was this one, and she walked through it because she had no choice. James listened. He asked, occasionally, a brief question, not to redirect the conversation, but to show he was tracking it, that the details mattered to him. It was, she realized, one of the more uncommon experiences she had ever had, the experience of being listened to by someone who was genuinely interested in what they were hearing. They stayed out until the cold settled in properly, which in the high desert happened quickly and with the authority of something that has been waiting its turn. When Hester stood to go inside, James stood too automatically, and they stood for a moment facing each other in the dark. "Good night, James," she said. "Good night, Hester," he said. She went inside. He stood there in the dark for considerably longer than was necessary before following. In the morning, the repair was not finished. Hatch's assessment had been optimistic. The axle needed work that required a part he did not have on hand, and Miguel had been sent to the nearest town capable of supplying it, which was half a day's ride. This meant another day at the way station. James delivered this information to Hester over the breakfast Esperanza had made as though feeding people were a calling rather than a task. "Another day," Hester said. "At least," he said. She nodded. She had the expression of a woman making adjustments to a plan that had already required many adjustments, adding one more to the stack with the practiced calm of someone who has decided that equanimity is more useful than upset. They spent the day doing what people did at way stations when they were waiting for something, finding small tasks to fill the time, talking, watching the road for the thin trail of dust that would announce Miguel's return. James helped Hatch repair a section of the corral fence that had been weakened by the spring, and Hester helped Esperanza with the baking she had been putting off. And there was a particular pleasantness to the day that Hester recognized and was almost afraid of, because it was the pleasantness of a life that was not the life she was being delivered to. In the afternoon, when the day's heat had reached its peak and then begun to ease back, Hester sat in the shade of the linta with a book she had found on Esperanza's shelf, a battered copy of a novel she had not read, which delighted her, and James came and sat nearby on an overturned water bucket with a bridle he was working on, replacing a cracked section of leather. They worked in companionable silence for a while. Then James said, without looking up from the leather, "What are you reading?" She told him the title. He had not heard of it. "It's a story about a woman who makes a decision that changes everything," she said. "The decision looks like the wrong one from the outside, but from the inside it's the only possible choice. That's what I find interesting about it." He looked up from the bridle. "And is the decision actually the wrong one?" "That depends on how you define wrong," she said. "It leads to a lot of difficulty. But the life she ends up with after the difficulty is the only life that actually belongs to her." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to the leather. "Sounds like it's worth reading," he said. She smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had produced in the entire journey, and it happened without her planning it, and James saw it without meaning to, and then found that he was looking at the bridle with considerably less concentration than before. Miguel returned that evening with the part. Hatch worked into the dark to get it fitted. By morning, the wagon was repaired and ready. James stood in the early light looking at the wagon and feeling something he did not have a precise name for, which was the fact that the repaired wagon represented the end of the delay, and the resumption of a delivery he was finding it increasingly difficult to feel good about. Hester came out of the way station with her trunk, which Miguel helped load. She thanked Esperanza with a genuine warmth that Esperanza returned in kind, pressing Hester's hands in both of hers and looking at her with the direct and knowing affection of a woman who understands more than she says. "You take care of yourself," Esperanza told her. "You hear me? You take care of yourself first." Hester nodded, and there was something in the way she nodded that suggested she had received the remark as more than a pleasantry. They set out. James drove the wagon this time because the lawyer's clerk was not there to drive it, and because he had decided, without making a formal decision, that he would rather be useful than merely adjacent. Hester sat on the bench beside him. Her trunk was in the back. The territory opened out ahead of them. They rode in comfortable silence for the first part of the morning, which was different from the silence of the first day, which had been the silence of two people who did not know each other. This was the silence of two people who had said enough to each other, that the spaces between the words were no longer empty. The road east ran through country that changed as they traveled, the flat scrubland giving way to low hills, then to a passage between red rock formations that rose on either side of the road and caught the morning light in colors that ranged from coral to deep crimson. It was genuinely beautiful in the way that harsh landscapes can be beautiful, which is to say with a beauty that does not apologize for itself or ask to be looked at. "I used to ride out here with my father when I was young," Hester said, looking up at the rock formations. "He said the land had a memory, that if you were quiet enough you could hear it thinking." "He sounds like a poet," James said. "He was," she said. "A very impractical one, as I mentioned. There are worse things to be." She looked at him. He was watching the road, and the sun was at an angle that lit his face from one side, and she noticed, not for the first time, that he was a man who held things quietly, not a cold person but a person whose warmth expressed itself in ways that required attention to see. "What are you, James?" she asked. "If we're assigning categories." He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "Practical," he said after a moment. "Is that all?" "Mostly," he said. Then, "My mother was a reader like your father. She believed in things. I inherited some of that, I think, just carry it differently." "What kinds of things did she believe in?" "That people were generally better than they appeared to be under pressure," he said. "That good land and honest work were as close to dignity as most people could get. That kindness was not a weakness." He paused. "She was right about all of it from what I've seen." Hester was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe all of those things too." They looked at each other briefly, and then both looked back at the road, and the road was long and the morning was bright, and the territory stretched out around them in all directions with the patience of something that has no need to hurry toward any particular conclusion. They stopped at noon to water the horse and eat from the provisions Esperanza had packed them: corn bread and dried meat, and 2 apples that she had wrapped separately in cloth, as though she understood they were the luxury in the parcel. James handed Hester one of the apples without comment, and she took it the same way, and they ate sitting on opposite sides of the wagon's shadow, because the sun was very direct and the shadow was not large. "Tell me about redemption," Hester said. James knew it from 2 previous visits, which was enough to describe it. He told her about the main street and the trading post, and the saloon and the church that had been built by a congregation of Baptist settlers who had arrived 3 years ago and were still there, which he said suggested the town had some durability. He told her about the general layout of the cattle operations in the surrounding area, and about the fact that the town was on a route that supply wagons used regularly, which meant it had better access to goods than its size would otherwise suggest. He did not tell her about Gerald Whitmore, because he did not know enough about Gerald Whitmore to say anything that would be useful rather than alarming, and he had no interest in alarming her. But she asked, "What do you know about him, about Whitmore?" James chose his words carefully. "I know he has a significant cattle operation. I know he has a reputation for hard dealing in business, which in this territory is not unusual. I know he is considered prosperous and influential." She heard what he had not said. She was very good at that. "And personally," she asked, "I have no first-hand knowledge." "But you have heard things," she said. He looked at her. The honesty she had already demonstrated was not a thing he could comfortably meet with convenient vagueness. "He is a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants," he said, "which matches what you already said about his letter." She absorbed this. "Yes," she said, "it does." They were quiet again. Then she said, not with self-pity but with the directness that characterized her, "I have thought very thoroughly about whether there is any alternative to this arrangement, and I cannot find one. I have no family. I have no money. I have no property. I am going to redemption because there is nowhere else to go, and I know that, and I am not telling you any of this to make you feel responsible for it. I am telling you because I think it is better to speak the truth of a thing plainly than to dress it up as something more acceptable than it is." James set down the heel of corn bread he had been holding and looked at his hands for a moment. "Hester," he said, just her name, and the way he said it was not nothing, it was the opposite of nothing. It was the word of a man who is trying to say something for which he does not have the right words yet. "Don't," she said gently. "Whatever you are going to say, don't. I don't want comfort that isn't true." "I wasn't going to offer comfort," he said. She looked at him. "I was going to say that you are one of the most," he started again. "That in 6 years of doing this work I have never," he stopped again. And the stopping was not the stopping of a man running out of words, but of a man choosing them more carefully than he is accustomed to choosing. "You have never what?" she asked quietly. "Met anyone like you," he said. The honesty of it sat between them in the dry afternoon air, uncovered and undeniable, like something that has been buried and has just worked its way to the surface. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. "This is a complicated situation for you to say that in," she said. "I know," he said. "You are being paid to deliver me somewhere. I know that too." She stood up and brushed the crumbs from her skirt and looked at the horizon to the east, and her back was to him for a moment while she thought, and he watched the back of her and the way the wind moved in her dark hair. She turned around. "Drive," she said. "We should keep moving." He drove. The afternoon passed with the color of the landscape deepening as the sun dropped, and the road grew rougher where it entered the first of the hill country, and James guided the horse carefully through the places where the track narrowed, and the rock came close on either side. There were birds he could not name calling from somewhere in the rock, and the smell of sage was very strong in the warming air. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, the road became briefly uncertain. A fork appeared that was not marked by anything other than the relative depth of the ruts in each direction, and James stopped the wagon and stood in the seat to look at both options. "Which way?" Hester asked. "Left should take us toward Cedar Spring," he said. "That's the route I was given. But these ruts are telling me something went right more recently." She stood up beside him and looked at both roads. "My father and I came through here once," she said, "years ago. I think the left road goes down into a canyon that floods in spring. He turned us around somewhere along it." James looked at the left road more carefully. The light was hitting the ground in a way that, now that she said it, suggested the road descended rather than stayed level. "Right then," he said. He took the right fork, and it proved the correct choice. It rejoined the main route after a mile and a half, coming out above a small spring where the grass was green in a ring around the water, and a group of pronghorns startled away at the approach of the wagon, bounding into the distance in those improbable floating leaps that made them seem like creatures designed by someone who found the physics of ordinary running insufficient. Hester laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it made her whole face different. Not that her face was not good before, but a laughing face is a different country than a composed one. James heard it and felt something in his chest rearrange itself without asking permission. "Pronghorn," she said, watching them recede. "Fastest animal in North America," he said. "My father told me that," she said. "He said they evolved to outrun predators that don't exist anymore, that they're built for a world that's already gone." James thought about that. "That's a melancholy way to think about a pronghorn," he said. "My father was a melancholy man under the poetry," she said, but she was still smiling when she said it, and the smile was still there when she looked at him and he was looking at her, and the smile changed when their eyes met, softened into something less defined but more present. She looked away first. He looked at the road. They reached the small settlement of Canyon Crossing by late afternoon. It was barely a settlement, a trading post, a cluster of adobe houses, a corral. But there was room to shelter for the night, and it would be unwise to push through the canyon country in the dark. The trading post owner, a man named Aurelio who spoke both English and Spanish with equal authority and a great deal of expression, welcomed them with the efficient hospitality of a man who considers travelers a normal feature of the landscape. He had a room at the back of the trading post that he rented to travelers and a wife, Dolers, who was currently making tamales in the kitchen, and who agreed to share them with 2 extra people with only minor renegotiation of the proportions. They ate at a table in the back room with Aurelio and Dolers and 3 of their children who ranged in age from very young to nearly grown, and the meal was very good, and the family was boisterous in the way of families who are comfortable together, talking across each other, and laughing at references that required shared history to understand. Hester sat in the middle of this and was visibly relaxed by it, by the simple animal comfort of a warm room and good food, and the noise of ordinary life. James watched her from across the table. She was talking to the oldest child, a girl of perhaps 14, who was asking her something with the earnest directness of a teenager who has not yet learned to moderate her curiosity. Hester was answering with equal earnestness, leaning forward slightly, and the lamplight was in her eyes, and she was not thinking about Gerald Whitmore or redemption or debt or any of it, and she was simply a person sitting at a table being present in the world. He thought, "I do not want to take her there." He had thought it before, in less formed ways. Now it was fully formed and fully present, and there was no longer any way to pretend it was not there. After the meal, Aurelio showed them the room, one room, which he presented with a shrug that acknowledged the situation and a second key that he handed to James without comment. Hester looked at the room, which contained 2 beds placed at opposite ends of it, and said, "That will be fine," with the practicality of a woman who has decided that dignity is a thing you carry with you, not a thing that depends on the size of your accommodations. James said good night at the door. Hester said good night from inside. He slept in the trading post's front room, on a cot that Aurelio produced from behind a shelf, and he lay awake considerably longer than the hour at which he closed his eyes. He was lying awake thinking about something practical that had occurred to him and was refusing to stop occurring to him. The lawyer in Santa Fe had paid him to deliver Hester Reed to Gerald Whitmore in redemption. That was the job. He was a man who did jobs as he was paid to do them. It was how he had built whatever small reputation he had, and whatever small amount of trust people placed in him when they handed him their important things to carry. Breaking that was not something he did. But he kept thinking about what she had said, that she had no alternative, that she had looked thoroughly and found none. He kept thinking about the fact that he knew, from years of moving through the territory, that there were places where a person could start over. Not easily, not without difficulty, but the territory was large, and it was not yet so organized that every piece of it was spoken for. He kept thinking about these things because he was, in the way he had admitted to her, partly his mother's son, a man who believed that people deserved better than the worst the world had in mind for them. He did not arrive at any decision. He went asleep eventually, and in the morning he drove the wagon to the door of the trading post and waited for Hester without having decided anything except that they had approximately one more day's ride before they reached redemption. She came out in the morning light with her hair pinned up and her face composed and her trunk packed, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something between them was different in the way that overnight silences can change things, the way a night of unshared thought still produces a shared result. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They set out. The canyon country was ahead of them, narrow and dramatic, and James drove with his full attention on the road because the canyon required it. The walls rose on either side and the sound changed more enclosed, the clatter of hooves richer and more resonant. The sky narrowed to a strip of blue far above them. Hester sat beside him on the bench, and her arm was close to his arm on the seat back, and neither of them moved to create more distance. This was not deliberate on either of their parts. It was simply the natural result of a bench that was not very wide and two people who were, by this point, not inclined to treat each other as strangers. Halfway through the canyon, the road curved around a large outcropping and revealed a view that opened suddenly and dramatically. The canyon floor fell away to the right, and the vista beyond it was enormous, miles of layered red country under a sky so blue it looked painted. Hester made a sound, not a word, just a sound, involuntary and full of feeling. "I know," James said. "Have you seen this before?" "Once," he said. "It doesn't get smaller." She was quiet for a while, looking at it as they passed. "Then I want to see things," she said. "That's the thing about this life, about being a woman in this territory. There are so many things to see, and so many of them are here in this very land, and the life I've been assigned does not leave much room for seeing." "It shouldn't be assigned," he said without planning to. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road, but his jaw was set in a particular way she had begun to recognize, which was the way it looked when he was working something out. "No," she said. "It shouldn't." They drove on. The canyon opened back up into the wider country of the Eastern Territory, and the road straightened, and redemption was somewhere ahead, half a day's ride at most. James pulled the wagon to a stop at a place where the road widened beside a stand of cottonwood trees. There was no practical reason to stop here. The horse didn't need water, there was no water. The road was fine. The day was fine. He sat with the reins in his hands and said nothing for a moment. "James," Hester said. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because I have been too," she said. "And I think we may have been thinking about the same thing, and I don't know what to do about it because I'm not the kind of person who does reckless things, and yet here I am." "Here you are," he said. "Here we both are," she said. The cottonwood leaves moved overhead with the lightest possible sound, a whisper of green against the quiet of the afternoon. A red-tailed hawk circled very high in the air above them, turning in slow, effortless spirals. "If there were somewhere else," James said carefully, "if there were a place that was not redemption, would you want that?" She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very clear and very direct, and she did not look like a woman who needed to be protected or rescued. She looked like a woman who had made very thorough calculations and was prepared to announce her conclusions. "I would want it," she said. But wanting is not the same as choosing. I have no resources and no plan, and I will not survive on wanting. What if you had both? He said. She was very still. I have money saved, he said. Not a great deal, but enough. I know land, I know where to look and what a fair price is. I know cattle and I know horses, and I know this territory better than most. I know where there's land available that's good land and accessible water and enough room to— He stopped, looked at the reins in his hands. I'm making this sound like a business proposition. You are, she said, a little. It's not, he said. He looked at her. I've been doing this work for 6 years, and I've delivered things and people, and I've been paid, and I've moved on. I have never in 6 years wanted to know what happened after I left. I have wanted that since almost the first hour I met you. I want to know what happens to you. He stopped again. I would very much like to be the person who knows. Her breath was not entirely steady. Neither was his. You are breaking a contract, she said. I am, he said. I'll repay the lawyer what he paid me, and I'll write him a letter explaining that circumstances changed and the delivery was not completed. That'll be the end of my career doing this work. And Gerald Whitmore, she said. He will not simply accept that. Whitmore is a man who understands leverage, James said. Right now his leverage is the debt. If the debt is settled by other means, there is no arrangement and no claim. She looked at him. You would settle my father's debt. It's the starting point, he said. Yes. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at them. The seriousness with which she was considering everything he had said was not the seriousness of a woman being swept away by feeling. It was the seriousness of a woman who had learned thoroughly that decisions with large consequences need to be made with full sight. Why? She asked. Not a challenge, a genuine question. He held her eyes. Because you are extraordinary, he said, and because the world is proposing to do a very ordinary and very unfair thing to you, and I find I cannot drive another mile toward it. Her eyes filled, not with tears that fell, but with the kind of fullness that precedes them, and sometimes, if the person is very determined, does not go past that. She blinked once. I'm not the kind of woman who cries at flattery, she said, with an imperfect voice. It's not flattery, he said. It's an observation. She looked at the cottonwood leaves overhead. Then she looked at him. James Dalton, she said, I am going to hold you to every word of what you just said. I expect you to, he said. She put her hand on his arm. It was brief, deliberate, the hand of a woman who does not touch casually, a touch that said yes and meant it and knew what it meant. He looked at her hand and then at her face, and then made a decision that had been building since the first morning, when she had settled into a saddle without needing help and looked at the horizon like a woman who had a right to it. He did not turn the wagon east. He turned it north. The letter to the lawyer was written from the next post office they passed through, which was in a small but functional town called Mesilla. James wrote it plainly and without excessive explanation. The escort had not been completed, the fee was being returned, and the arrangement between Miss Reed and Mr. Whitmore was no longer operative. He enclosed every cent the lawyer had paid him, and a brief, factual sentence acknowledging that Mr. Whitmore might have legal recourse regarding the debt, which James intended to settle through separate correspondence. Hester stood beside him while he wrote the letter and read it when it was done. You don't mince words, she said. Mincing words costs more than it's worth, he said. She signed her own name at the bottom beneath his, because it was her life and her decision, and she intended it to be on record that way. They mailed the letters from Mesilla. There were 2 of them, the one to the lawyer, and a second one James had written to a man named Thomas Aldridge in the town of Cimarron, with whom he had done business before, who dealt in land and who would know what was available and at what terms. Standing on the wooden walkway in front of the post office in Mesilla, Hester took a very slow breath, and then another, and James stood beside her while she did it and did not rush her. That's the first thing I've done entirely of my own choosing in almost 6 months, she said. How does it feel? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Terrifying, she said, and correct. He smiled, a real one, not the small, controlled expression she had seen before, but a genuine smile that entirely changed the geography of his face, and she saw it and blinked and then made no effort to look away from it. "What?" he said. "You should do that more often," she said. "What?" "Smile like that," she said. He looked embarrassed, which made the smile larger, which made her laugh. They spent the night in Mesilla, in a proper boarding house that had separate rooms and a dining room, and a woman who ran it named Mrs. Ortega, who served a supper that included fresh tortillas and red chili that was serious enough to make the eyes water, and that both Hester and James consumed with considerable appreciation. At supper, for the first time in the entire journey, they talked without the weight of the destination pressing on the conversation. They talked about everything, about books and about horses, and about the territory, and about what James's mother had been like in specific rather than general terms, and about Hester's theory that the Mexican land grant disputes were the most significant and least discussed injustice in the entire territory, which James agreed with after she laid out her reasoning, and which led them into a conversation that went 20 minutes past the point where Mrs. Ortega had stopped bringing coffee and was clearly waiting for them to notice. She wanted to close the dining room. They noticed, eventually, and apologized, and went to their respective rooms. James lay on his bed and looked at the ceiling, and thought that he could not remember the last time a conversation had lasted past his interest in it, because he had always been the one who ran out of things to say first. He did not run out. The reply from Thomas Aldridge came faster than expected, within 3 days of their arrival in Cimarron, where James had taken them because he knew the town and knew it was large enough to offer Hester reasonable comfort while they waited. Aldridge was a brisk and efficient man who regarded the finding of land as a puzzle with a practical solution, and his letter confirmed that there was a piece of property northeast of Cimarron, 160 acres of decent grass and reliable water from a spring-fed creek, that had reverted to territorial availability after the original claimant had abandoned it 2 years prior. The price was manageable. The situation was sound. James showed the letter to Hester over breakfast in the boarding house where they were staying, and she read it with her coffee in her hand and the morning light coming through the window at an angle that lit her face from the left and made her look, he thought, like a painting in a gallery, except more alive than any painting and infinitely more interesting. "It's real land," she said. "It is," he said, "with water. A spring-fed creek. That's not nothing in this territory." She set the letter down and looked at him across the table. They had, over the past several days, arrived at a kind of ease with each other that was the ease of people who have established trust through honesty, not the performed ease of people pretending to be comfortable, but the genuine kind that does not require maintenance. "James," she said, "there is something we haven't discussed." "There are several things," he said. "One in particular," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were doing something careful. "We are talking about a piece of land as though it belongs to both of us, and I am not complaining about that. I want to be clear that I am not complaining. But I want to name what that means explicitly because I have already had one arrangement made about my life without explicit discussion, and I would rather not have another one." He set his own cup down. He had the look of a man who had been building toward this and was relieved to be arriving at it. "What it means," he said, "is that I would like to ask you to marry me. That is what it means, explicitly." She was quiet. "I understand that this is fast," he said. "I understand that we have known each other for a number of days that does not, by ordinary measure, constitute a sufficient basis for that question. But I also think that the number of days is not always the relevant measurement. I think the more relevant measurement is the number of honest conversations, and by that count I feel that I know you in ways that matter." "I feel the same," she said quietly. "And I know that the previous arrangement you were in was not a choice," he said. "And I want to be clear, I am asking, not arranging, not deciding, asking." She looked at him. He looked back. The morning light was very clear and the room was quiet, and there was a cat somewhere in the boarding house that was making its presence known by a distant, comfortable sound. "Yes," she said. The word was simple and complete, and she did not add anything to it because it did not need anything added. James breathed out. He had not been aware of holding his breath, but he had been, and the release of it was considerable. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was something he had not done before, and she let him take it, and their hands were warm together on the table between the coffee cups. "I don't have a ring," he said. "Get me a book," she said. He laughed. She laughed. The morning was very good. They were married in Cimarron 6 days later, at the office of the Justice of the Peace, which was a room in the back of the land registry office, and smelled of paper and ink, and was presided over by a man named Judge Harmon, who had a ceremonial approach to his responsibilities, and read the vows with a gravity that suggested he had not forgotten that they mattered. Hester wore the best dress she had, which was a deep blue wool that she had packed on the theory that one should always have something presentable. James had acquired a clean shirt and vest that he had pressed at the boarding house, and he had shaved with a care that suggested awareness of the occasion. Thomas Aldridge, who had come to town to finalize the land papers, served as witness, and Mrs. Ortega's counterpart at the Cimarron boarding house, a woman named Mrs. Chavez, who had taken a proprietary interest in both of them over the week, came to watch and cried with the forthright emotion of a woman who considers weddings among the more worthwhile events the world produces. Hester had thought about what she felt, standing in that small, ink-smelling room, and she had reached a conclusion that surprised her with its completeness. She was not afraid. She had thought she might be. The last time marriage had been a subject in her life, it had been associated with fear and powerlessness, and the particular dread of being handed to someone like a piece of property. Now she stood beside James Dalton, a man she had known for 11 days and trusted as deeply as she had ever trusted anyone, and she felt not afraid but full of something she did not have a single word for, but that encompassed certainty and warmth, and the specific joy of a thing that is freely chosen. James said his vows looking at her directly, in his deliberate and honest way, and she said hers the same way. Judge Harmon pronounced them married with the satisfaction of a man who still finds the job meaningful. James held her face in his hands and kissed her once, carefully, with a tenderness that made Mrs. Chavez cry harder, and Hester put her hands over his and kissed him back, and the world rearranged itself into a better shape. The land was theirs by the end of the same week. James had the papers signed and recorded, and he spread them on the table in their room at the boarding house, and Hester leaned over them with her hair loose around her shoulders. They were in private, and she had unpinned it and read every word, because she was the kind of woman who read every word. 160 acres, she said, and the water rights to the creek, he said, and the water rights, she agreed. She traced the boundaries on the map with one finger. How much of it is good grass? I'd say 60 acres of reliable grass, maybe more in a wet year. The rest is manageable for some use. She stood up and looked at him. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his arms on his knees, watching her read the papers with an expression she had come to recognize as his particular form of contentment, quiet, attentive, present. "We need cattle," she said. "We do. And a house, if the existing structure is as described. It'll need work." "I can work," she said. "I know you can," he said. She sat down beside him. Their arms were touching, and she leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her with the ease of a man who has determined that this is exactly where his arm should be. "James," she said, I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "I did not want any of this," she said. "Not the journey, not the arrangement with Whitmore. None of it. And I was not a person who believed that things would work out, because I had watched things very specifically not work out for a person I loved." She paused. "But something in me held on to, I don't know, not hope exactly, more like readiness. The willingness to see what was there rather than only what was supposed to be there." He was listening with his whole self, which was a thing she had noticed early and still found remarkable. "You were there," she said, "and I saw you." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I'm glad you did," he said. "I needed seeing." They made their way to the property in early June, when the light was long and the grass was green enough to fulfill the land agent's descriptions without apology. The existing structure was indeed in need of work. It was an adobe house with a sound foundation and walls that had held up, but the roof needed significant repair, and several of the interior elements required complete replacement. There was a barn in better condition, and the spring-fed creek was everything the description had promised. Hester walked the property on the first morning, alone, while James was examining the barn. She walked all the way to the creek and stood on its bank and watched the water move over the stones with the clear purposefulness of water that has been moving for centuries and intends to continue. She put her hand in the water and felt the cold of it and looked up at the sky above the tree line and took a breath that went all the way down to her feet. This was hers, theirs, chosen. She went back to find James and found him already assessing what the barn needed with a methodical satisfaction that expressed itself in list-making on a piece of paper he had produced from somewhere. He looked up when she appeared. "Creek's good?" he asked. "The creek is very good," she said. They worked through the summer. They were not alone in the work. In this part of the territory, neighbors were few, but the distances between them were large, and the recognition that everyone needed something from someone else produced a particular kind of practical community. A man named Abe Whitfield, who had a homestead 3 miles north, arrived one July morning with his son and 2 other men from further out, and in 2 days of cooperative labor they replaced the roof of the house entirely. Hester fed them all and did a share of the carrying and hauling beside them, and Mrs. Whitfield came on the second day with a pie that she said was no trouble, but that had clearly required significant effort. There was a woman named Clara Morton who lived closer to Cimarron and rode out once a week for the first month to check on them, in the way of a person who has decided that a new family is something worth checking on. She was the same age as Hester, lively and practical and possessed of opinions she expressed freely, and she and Hester became friends with the unceremonious speed of 2 people who recognize each other. "You married fast," Clara said one afternoon, sitting on the porch of the house that was now functional and had curtains that Hester had made from cloth bought in town. "I did," Hester said. "No regrets." "Not a single one," Hester said, which was the complete truth. "He seems like a steady man," Clara said, watching James in the distance, mending a section of the fence line with the methodical competence of a man who has determined that each post will be right before he moves to the next. "He is," Hester said, "the steadiest person I have ever known." By autumn, the cattle were in. James had purchased a small starter herd with careful deliberation, 12 cows and a good young bull, from a rancher near Cimarron who respected James's knowledge and his willingness to inspect every animal before agreeing to a price. The herd was modest but sound, and James's intention was to expand it slowly and correctly, which was the only kind of expansion that made permanent sense. There was a letter from the lawyer in Santa Fe that arrived in September. James read it and told Hester what it said, which was that Gerald Whitmore had received his letter and had been, apparently, displeased. The lawyer had written to inform James of this displeasure in the tone of a man covering himself professionally. He had also noted, with considerably less apparent concern, that as James had repaid his fee and had in addition paid off the Reed debt through a separate bank draft which James had arranged before they left Cimarron, using the majority of his savings, there was no legal claim outstanding and the matter was, from a legal standpoint, closed. "Is there anything more Whitmore can do?" Hester asked. "He could make trouble," James said. "Men like him sometimes do when they feel a deal has been undone. But he's in redemption and we're here, and the territory is wide and his business interests keep him occupied. I think the most likely outcome is that he finds another woman to send for." The thought of that was briefly dark, but it was outside of their ability to prevent. They could only do what they had done. "Then it's done," Hester said. "It's done," James confirmed. She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the stove, and the stove accepted it without ceremony, and that was the end of Gerald Whitmore in their lives. Christmas of 1878 was quiet and cold and very good. They had a proper Christmas dinner that Hester made with Clara's help and the company of the Whitfields, who came with their son, and a gift of a bottle of whiskey that James received with genuine appreciation, and that Abe Whitfield proceeded to assist him in acknowledging. The house was warm, and the smell of the food filled it, and there was a small spruce tree that James had cut and brought inside, and that Hester had decorated with ribbon, and the few glass ornaments that had been packed in her trunk from the old house, the last physical remnants of her life before, transformed into something that belonged to the new one. She sat by the stove after the Whitfields had gone and James was washing up in the kitchen, and she had a piece of ribbon in her hand that she'd taken from the tree, and she was thinking. James came and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and they looked at the tree together. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am happy," she said, "that it is a strange and significant thing, and that I want to be sure I am properly aware of it." He pulled her in closer. "Are you properly aware?" "Very," she said. He kissed her temple. She leaned into him, and they stayed like that in the warm room while the fire in the stove spoke quietly to itself, and the night outside was clear and cold and full of stars. By the end of the following spring, 1879, Hester knew she was expecting a child. She told James on a Tuesday morning in April, standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands because she had been making bread, and she told him in the direct way she had of saying things she needed to say, without preamble or circumlocution. His face did something complete and involuntary that she had never seen it do before, a joy that spread from the center outward and made him look, briefly, very young. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her flour-covered hands in his and held them. "When?" he asked. "October, I think," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers and breathed. She laughed because the flour from her hands was now on his shirt. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't care," he said, which was clearly true. Clara came over when she heard the news and brought apple preserves and a long list of practical advice about the management of pregnancy in the territory, which was delivered with equal parts warmth and efficiency, and which Hester received gratefully. Esperanza, from the way station, sent a package with a note that had somehow tracked them through Clara's address in Cimarron. She had heard the news from some chain of communication that Hester could not entirely trace, and the package contained 2 hand-sewn things that could only be baby garments, beautifully made, and a note that said simply, "I knew that morning. Take care of each other." Hester read the note 3 times and then put it with the few things she kept that mattered most. The child was born in October, as predicted, a boy, born on a night that was clear and very cold, in the house they had built into something real together. Clara was there, and a midwife from Cimarron named Mrs. Delgado, who had been doing this work for 30 years, and who conducted the entire business with a calm authority that was the most reassuring thing Hester had ever encountered. James was not permitted in the room, which was standard practice, and he sat outside the door in the hallway on a chair that was too small for him, and experienced approximately 4 hours of what he would later describe, with significant understatement, as a challenging evening. He could hear Hester's voice through the door, not the words but the sound of her, and he sat with his hands clasped and his head down and addressed, privately and with great sincerity, whatever it was that oversaw the outcomes of important nights. The baby cried. James was on his feet before he had decided to stand. Mrs. Delgado opened the door. "A boy," she said. "Both well." James went in. Hester was exhausted in the particular way of a woman who has done something enormous and come out the other side of it. Her hair was loose and her face was damp, and she was looking at the bundle in her arms with an expression he had not seen on any face before, which was the expression of a person encountering something they had not understood until the moment of encounter. He came to the side of the bed and looked at his son. The child was very small and very new, and his face was the face of something not yet finished, ancient and new at once, in the paradoxical way of newborns. "Hello," James said, which was an absurd thing to say and also the only possible thing. Hester looked up at him. Her eyes were full. "He looks like your mother," she said. He had told her what his mother looked like. He was startled that she had remembered. "Around the mouth," she said. "The set of it." He sat on the edge of the bed carefully, and she leaned against him, and they both looked at the child together, and the room was very quiet. "What do we call him?" James asked. They had discussed names, but without settling. Hester had held several in reserve, and now she looked at the child and made her decision the way she made most decisions, directly and with confidence. "William," she said, "for no one in particular, just because it suits him." "William Dalton," James said. "William James Dalton," she corrected. He looked at her. She looked back with the steady directness that was her particular gift. "Hester," he said, "don't make a production of it," she said. "It's just a name." "It's not just a name," he said. "Fine," she said. "It's not just a name." He held her and the child together, and the October night outside was very dark and very full of stars. The following years built themselves one on another with the particular solidity of years that are made from honest work and genuine partnership. The herd grew slowly and correctly, as James had intended, until by 1882 they had 60 head of good cattle and the beginnings of a small but respected reputation among the ranchers in the region. James was known as a man who dealt honestly, which was not the most common reputation in the territory, but was the most durable one. Hester ran the books with the same competence she had applied to her father's ranch, but with the advantage of doing it for something that was genuinely hers, which made the work a different quality of thing. She also, in the way of a woman with wide-ranging interest and persistent curiosity, became involved in the efforts of several families in the region who were attempting to establish a school. The nearest school was many miles from most of the homesteads, and the children of the territory were growing up either educated by their families or not educated at all, which was an injustice she found too specific and too correctable to ignore. She wrote letters and organized meetings and attended the meetings in Cimarron alongside Clara and several other women, and she made the arguments with the clarity and thoroughness of a woman who reads 3 languages and has opinions about almost everything. The school was established in 1882 in a building that was partly funded by a dozen families and partly by a donation that she had extracted, through a combination of persistence and well-reasoned correspondence, from the county seat. It was not large. It was adequate, and it was there, and the children who attended it were getting something they had not been getting before. James attended the opening of the school with William on his shoulders, because William was 3, and had decided that the best position for observing public events was from the highest available vantage point. He watched his wife speak to the assembled families with the calm authority of a woman who has been listened to enough times to know she is worth listening to, and he felt a pride in her that was not the pride of possession, not the pride of a man whose wife is accomplished, but the pride of someone who knows they are standing next to a person who is genuinely remarkable and has the good fortune to know it. Hester came back to him after the speeches were done and took William from his shoulders and settled the boy on her hip and looked at James with the look she had that said she knew what he was thinking and was not embarrassed by it. "Stop looking at me like that in public," she said. "I'll try," he said. "I can't guarantee the results." She rolled her eyes. He smiled the wide, genuine smile that she had told him early on he should produce more often, and he had taken her advice, and the territory had become a slightly warmer place for it. In 1883, their second child arrived. A daughter this time, born in March when the thaw was beginning and the creek was running fast. They called her Eleanor, which was the name of James's mother, and this time Hester told him that was who it was for, and he said nothing for a long moment, and then thanked her in the way of a man who does not take important things lightly. Eleanor was fair where William was dark and loud where William was thoughtful, and she arrived in the world apparently intending to be noticed, which she consistently was. The spring she arrived was a good spring, green and wet in the way that the territory occasionally produced, as though it wished to demonstrate what it was capable of when the conditions cooperated. The cattle were fat on the new grass, and the creek was full, and the garden that Hester had established behind the house was producing with an optimism that suggested even the plants had decided this was a good year. James stood at the door of the house one evening in that spring, Alina a few weeks old and in Hester's arms in the rocking chair inside, and William outside running very fast for no particular reason in the way of small children, and the sun going down in the west in a performance of color that was extravagant even by the territory's standards, and he thought about where he had been 5 years before, riding escort jobs, moving from place to place, delivering things. Being, as Hester had said in the beginning, practical and not much more. He thought about the wagon with the cracked axle. He thought about turning right at the fork in the road. He thought about sitting on a fence rail under a sky full of stars and listening to a woman talk and not wanting her to stop. He went inside. Hester looked up from the rocking chair. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just wanted to be in here." She accepted this as the complete answer it was, and moved the chair slightly so he could sit beside her. And he sat beside her in the lamplight, while their daughter slept in her arms, and their son came charging in from outside full of reports about something he had seen that required immediate narration. And the house was warm, and the evening was long, and the land outside was theirs. There was a morning in the late summer of 1884 when James came in from the barn and found Hester at the kitchen table with a letter. He recognized the expression on her face, not troubled exactly, but engaged with something that required processing. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. It was from the lawyer in Santa Fe, not the same one, a different one handling an estate. It seemed that Clarence Reed had, in addition to his visible debts, a small piece of property in the Rio Grande Valley that had been overlooked in the original proceedings. A second piece of land, modest in size but legally clear, that had been located during the settling of another estate and that had now been identified as belonging properly to Hester. James read the letter twice. Then he looked at her. "Your father," he said. "Apparently he bought it years ago before I was born and never mentioned it," she said. "Or perhaps mentioned it once and I was too young to retain the information." She had the expression of a woman who finds her late father simultaneously aggravating and dear. "It's not large, but it's additional land." "In the valley," James said. "That's good grazing." "Yes," she said, "it is." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. And something in both of their faces was aware, without needing to say it, that Clarence Reed, impractical poet that he had managed to leave his daughter something real after all, just circuitously, and after considerable delay and with impeccable timing. He would have loved that, Hester said, that it came through this way. He had a gift for conclusions that were satisfying in retrospect. "He sounds more like you every time you describe him," James said. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. She stood up from the table and came to where he was standing, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood like that in the kitchen in the summer morning with the whole good day ahead of them. The Rio Grande Valley land was added to what they held and grazed well, as James had predicted. The herd grew again, this time more quickly, and by 1885 they were established enough that James was able to hire 2 men to help manage the cattle operation. Good men. One of them a vaquero named Carlos who knew cattle with the encyclopedic thoroughness of someone who had spent his entire life among them, and whose knowledge James learned from without embarrassment, because learning was more useful than pride. William was 6 and Alina was 2, and the house had been expanded once already, and would need to be expanded again. And the schoolhouse that Hester had helped build was now full enough to have acquired a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Haverford from Missouri who had answered the advertisement Hester had placed, and who had arrived with 2 trunks of books, and an opinion of the territory that improved significantly, once she was actually in it. Life in the territory in the 1880s was not simple. The injustices that Hester had spoken about with James on that long first journey, the land disputes, the treatment of the Hispanic and indigenous families who had prior claims to much of the territory that were systematically disregarded, the violence that the cattle wars in the South were producing, these were real and present, and they were things that a person of conscience could not simply ignore by being comfortable. Hester did not ignore them. She wrote letters. She organized what could be organized from the distance of their ranch. She spoke plainly when speaking plainly was possible. She could not fix everything, and she was honest with herself about that, but she contributed to the efforts of the people who were trying, which she considered the least that was required. James supported all of it, not as a man supporting a wife's hobby, but as a man who shared her convictions, and who acted on them in his own domain, dealing with Carlos and his other hands with equitable fairness, paying honest wages, refusing to participate in the land-grabbing behaviors that some of the larger cattle operations engaged in to the west. It was not a perfect life. No life is. There were hard winters and dry summers, and a year when illness moved through the region, and they nursed William through a fever that required 3 days of near-constant attention before it broke and left them both weak with relief. There were disputes with neighboring ranchers about boundaries, resolved through the kind of direct and effortful negotiation that James did well. There was a period when the cattle market dropped, and the financial margins were narrow enough to require adjustment and careful management, which Hester applied with the competence that she had always applied to any problem that yielded to intelligence and persistence. Through all of it, through every hard season and every good one, they were the same to each other, present, honest, warm. They argued occasionally, because they were both people who had opinions and did not find it easy to suppress them, and their arguments were usually about practical matters, and usually resolved within the day because neither of them believed in carrying disagreement past the point where it was still useful. They never argued about anything fundamental, because they were, at the level of fundamentals, in agreement about the things that mattered. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, James left the ranch in Carlos's capable hands and took Hester to Cimarron for dinner at the hotel dining room, which was the finest restaurant within a reasonable distance, and which they had been to twice before, once for her birthday, and once when the herd expanded to 50 head, and they had decided that was worth marking. They sat across from each other at a table with a cloth on it and candles and food that was considerably more elaborate than what they ate at home, and Hester wore the blue wool dress that she had worn to their wedding. She had kept it carefully, and it still fit, which she attributed to ranch life, and James wore his good coat and had his hair tamed and looked, she thought, entirely fine in the way she had thought he was entirely fine from approximately the 2nd day of their journey together. 5 years, she said across the table. 5 years, he confirmed. What do you think about that? He considered it. I think it has been the best 5 years of my life, he said. And I think the next 5 will be better. That's a bold claim, she said. I'm a practical man, he said. I don't make claims I can't support. She smiled. He smiled back. The candle between them was warm and the evening was a good one, and outside the hotel window the town of Cimarron went about its business with the reassuring industry of a place that intends to still be there in another 5 years. James, she said. Hester. I want to tell you something that I have thought about a great deal and want to say properly. He gave her his full attention, which was the way he gave attention to things that mattered. I was being driven toward a life that I would have endured, she said. Not lived, endured. And the road broke and the axle cracked and you turned right instead of left and then north instead of east, and every one of those things was the world making a decision on my behalf that I could not have made for myself at that point. And I know that sounds like I am crediting fate, which I don't entirely believe in. She paused. But I believe in you, and I believe in us. And I want you to know that being married to you is not something I endure. It is the life I would have chosen if anyone had ever thought to ask me what I wanted. He was very still across the table. Hester, he said, in the voice he had when words were genuinely insufficient. I know, she said. No, let me say it, he said. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known. You are the reason I understand what a home is, because I spent a long time not knowing. You are the reason the ranch is what it is, and the school exists, and William knows how to think, and Alina is going to be absolutely formidable when she grows up. He paused. And you are the reason I stopped being a man who only moved through places and became a man who stays. She reached across the table and took his hand. He held it. They finished dinner and walked back to the hotel through the clear October night, because they had stayed in a room for the occasion, and Cimarron was at rest in the way of a town settling toward sleep. Above them, the sky was what it always was in the territory, enormous, and full of stars, and bigger than anywhere else in the world. The years continued to make themselves from good materials. William, at 8, began to show an interest in the cattle operation that expressed itself in constant and detailed questions, which James answered with patience, because he considered that the questions of a curious child were among the more worthwhile things to engage with. Alina, at 4 and then at 5, was indeed formidable. She had her mother's directness and her father's stillness in reserve, which was a combination that already, in a child of 5, suggested a person who would be entirely capable of managing the world in her own terms. A third child arrived in 1887, a boy they named Robert after no one in particular, because they had used the significant names, and this child seemed like a person who would make his name mean something on his own rather than needing to borrow it. He arrived in February, which was cold, and he arrived quickly and efficiently in a way that Mrs. Delgado, who was still practicing and came back for all of them, suggested a child with a specific agenda. Robert was a cheerful child, easy and warm, and he arrived into a family that had room for him in every sense: room in the house, which had been expanded again, room in the life, which had enough comfort and enough work to accommodate another person's joy in it, and room in the hearts of everyone already there, which William proved by being unexpectedly tender about the baby, and Alina proved by immediately assuming supervisory responsibilities that no one had assigned her. The ranch continued to grow, and to be what James and Hester had made it: honest and sound. Carlos had been with them for 4 years and had become, in the way of someone whose expertise and reliability have been consistently respected, something closer to a partner in the operation than an employee. He had his own stake in the land now, a small piece to the south of their main property, that James had helped him acquire on fair terms. The two of them managed the operation together with a complementary efficiency, James handling the external dealings and the finances, Carlos handling the cattle, and the land with a mastery that James was comfortable crediting openly. In 1888, Hester accepted a position on the board of the new county school committee, which had been formalized as the school system in the region grew. It required her to go into Cimarron twice a month, which she did, riding the distance herself with the ease of a woman who has spent a decade in the saddle and does not find it remarkable. Clara was also on the committee, which made the meetings more efficient and more entertaining than they might otherwise have been. James rode with her when he could and waited for her in the town when he did, using the time to conduct whatever business needed conducting, which was usually enough to fill the hours. He was not a man who felt threatened by the fact that his wife was capable in public in her efforts. He was, on the contrary, quietly proud in the way he had always been, not the pride of possession, but the pride of someone who knows that the person beside them is doing important and real things and is glad to be beside them while they do it. There was a day in the early spring of 1889, William 10, Alina 6, Robert 2, when James and Hester rode out alone on the property after the children were settled for the evening with Carlos and his wife, who had taken on the role of household anchors with the comfortable authority of people who have decided a family is worth contributing to. They rode to the high point of the property, a low ridge above the spring-fed creek where the view took in most of their land in one direction and the long reach of the territory in every other. They sat on their horses side by side and looked at it. The evening light was the color it always was at this hour in this country, gold and long and full of a clarity that made everything sharp-edged and present. "Do you remember," Hester said, "what you told me that first night, at the way station when we sat outside?" "I told you I was listening," he said. "Yes," she said. "You said I'm listening, and you said it in a way that meant you actually were." "I was," he said. "I had forgotten what that felt like," she said. "Being listened to." She looked at him. "You have never stopped." He looked back at her with the directness that was his particular quality, the directness of a man who does not look away from important things. "I never will," he said. She reached out from her saddle and he reached from his, and their hands met in the space between their horses, and they held on in the evening light above the creek that ran through their land and the grass that was greening up for another season, and the sky that was growing its stars in the east while the west was still burning. The territory around them was wild still, in the way that places are wild when they are still being made, full of difficulty and beauty in equal measure, full of injustice that was slow to correct and goodness that was sometimes surprising and a bigness that did not accommodate the ordinary human tendency to make everything smaller than it was. They had made something here, not small, not ordinary. Something that had been built from a broken axle and a wrong turn, and an honest conversation on a fence rail under a sky full of stars, and that had grown steadily, correctly, the way James had always believed good things should grow, into a life that was entirely and completely their own. William would grow into the land in a way that surprised no one who knew him, inheriting his father's patience and his mother's precision, and adding his own particular quality to the operation, which was a gift for seeing what was not yet there. Eleanor would grow into a woman who made the county school committee by the time she was 30, and who wrote letters to the territorial government that were, by all accounts, more effective than they had any right to be. Robert would grow into the most gregarious rancher in the region, which was not what anyone predicted for the cheerful 2-year-old of 1889, but which suited him entirely. But all of that was ahead. In the spring of 1889, on the ridge above the creek, it was just 2 people on horses holding hands in the last of the evening light, in a country so large it required no embellishment, in a life that had been found by the specific combination of a cracked axle and a choice to stop driving east. James looked at Hester and she looked at him, and they were both where they were supposed to be, which was here together, in the enormous and starlit dark of the territory that they called home.